Today, we're going to talk about flavor and building flavor and putting flavor into our recipes and talk about how we build really full dishes, right? Dishes that hit all of our senses the way that we want them to. All right. And so here in this picture, I've got an image of me smoking ribs on the left-hand side and of Remy the rat from Ratatouille on the right-hand side, right? And both of these get at how we think about generating flavor, the different techniques we use to generate flavor, and how we pair different ingredients to make new flavor experiences. All right, so as in every time we go into one of these, we want to talk about the chemical underpinnings of how we experience flavor. All right, this is a picture of lifesavers, right? And the different kinds of lifesavers that we have, right? Watermelon, tangerine, pineapple, grape, raspberry, and cherry, and the chemical components of where their flavors come from. Okay, a fun experiment or exercise to do at home is to have someone give you a lifesaver, right? And you want to do this with your eyes closed and your nose pinched, and then you're going to pop the lifesaver into your mouth and see if you can guess what flavor it is. And chances are good that you're not going to be able to do that. And what that highlights is that the way we experience flavor doesn't just happen on our tongues, right? A big part of flavor is our tongue, right? We experience taste on our tongue. So things that are salty or sour or sweet or savory or bitter, things like that, we experience on our tongues as taste, right? But a big part of flavor happens in our noses, in our nasal passageways. Right? All of those wonderful odors that we get happen in our nasal passageways. And so chances are when you put that lifesaver in your mouth, no matter which flavor of lifesaver you have in your mouth, you're going to taste some sweet and some salty because that's what's there, right? And some acid, some sweet and some acid, not sweet and salty, some sweet and some acid. And they're all going to taste somewhat similar, right? But when you release your nose and start to breathe through your nose with that lifesaver in your mouth, you're going to get some of those unique parts of the lifesavers. And so a lot of what we experience as flavor happens in our noses, in our nasal passageways. Okay, and in this picture here, you can see some diagrams of some neurons that are going up to our brain. At the very end of those neurons that reach into our nasal passageways are these protein receptors, these big proteins that translate a chemical signal into a biological signal that will eventually turn out to inform how we experience flavor. Okay, so most foods that we eat are super complex. They're really complex. The lifesavers are really simple food, right? They have some sugar, they've got some acid, and they've got a couple of flavor molecules and some color molecules, right? But the number of flavor molecules in them they're very small, right? There aren't that many flavor molecules in them. They're very simple. Most foods that we eat are much more complex. The image on the left here is from James Kennedy, who is a chemical educator in Australia. And so he's gone through and listed the ingredients for lots of natural foods. So strawberries, for example, right? There are tons of chemicals in strawberries. And when we eat strawberries, we experience all of the flavor chemicals in strawberries all at once. And so our brains translate those flavors not as the individual components, but as the full flavor experience. When we eat a strawberry, we taste strawberry. We're not tasting all of those individual molecules on their own. Our brain sort of integrates all of those external stimuli, right? The chemicals that we're getting. They translate all those flavor molecules into strawberry. There are lots of, when you look at the individual components, they all have their own individual flavors. But again, when you put them all together in the amounts that are in strawberry, we get this strawberry flavor. Okay, so foods are really complex. And so this complexity, or the way we look at flavors and different flavor experiences, can help to inform us on how we put ingredients together in general. And I want to look at several different schools of thought for how we go about doing that. right? And we're going to do this through three different books. The first is The Art of Flavor by Daniel Patterson and Mandy Aftel. And so this book looks at food synesthetically, right? So food has ingredients have qualities, right? They have sharp notes or round flavors, things like that. They get you to think about foods in sort of different language, right? And not as in terms of necessarily flavor, but other descriptive properties. Another book that we'll be talking about is The Flavor Matrix by James Briscioni. This one uses flavor pairing theory to think about how we put ingredients together. And the other book that we'll talk about is Salt, Fat, Acid, and Heat by Samin Nosrat. This is one of my favorite cookbooks from the past several years. And she talks about how these components, salt, fat, acid, and heat, need to come together to make really full dishes. Okay, so all of these books take a slightly different point of view on how we put ingredients together and how we think about pairing different ingredients. But um, in the end, we can use all of these interchangeably, right? There are similarities, or there are ways to view the recipes in salt, fat, acid, and heat with the point of view in the flavor matrix. So there is no one right way to think about putting flavors together, right? There's no one right way to do it. But in thinking about all of these, we can kind of come up with our own intuition for how we put ingredients together. Okay, so let's take a look at the first one, The Art of Flavor. Again, this one uses synesthetic, so terms like sharp or round or full to describe flavors. They also use orchestral qualities, right? So in this one, top notes, middle notes, and bass notes. For a full orchestra, we want all of those kinds of notes coming together to make the music that we're listening to. And so when we think about foods, we want all of those kinds of notes to come together to make the food that we're eating. Our base notes are our anchor. These are the most prominent ingredients in the dish, and they tend to have a lasting flavor on our palates. Right? They stick with us as we're eating our meal. So think about roasted meats or roasted vegetables. These are very savory flavors that stay on our palates even after we've swallowed the bite that we're eating. I'm going to move now to the top notes. These top notes don't last as long. They're really fleeting, right? They don't last. They're short. They hit us really quickly. These are most often herbs. They can be spices. They tend to be things that are not cooked. But as you're bringing sort of the food to your mouth, you get hit with these right away, with these aromas right away. And so they hit and then they're gone. Okay. We also need middle notes, something to connect the base notes to the top notes. We want a way to meld those together. And that's what our middle notes do. So we're going to look at a recipe from this book and talk about where these come from. Okay, so one of the recipes that I will talk about from this book is braised greens with lemon and olive oil. Okay, our base note here, right? This is the part that sticks with us, the heavier part. Our braised greens are our base note. They're the primary component of our dish, and as we're eating them, those greens are very savory, and they've got all sorts of other great flavors as well. All right, our top note in this, all right, is at the end, after we're done cooking with whatever else we cook with, we're going to add some freshly squeezed lemon juice and maybe a little bit of finishing olive oil to it. Olive oil can be a great finishing note, a great top note. There are tons of floral, fruity, spicy olive oils that we can get that add lots of extra flavor to the food that we're eating. All right, so we need some way to balance those out, a middle for this. And we've got lots of choices here, right? You can use sauteed garlic or onion. You can add chili flakes. You can use fish sauce. There are lots of different ways to meld these ingredients together, but you can't just do the base note and the top note. You want those middle notes as well. So if you just did braised greens and then topped it with olive oil, right, it would not be as full of a dish, as pleasing of a dish. And so the idea here is you want to get some middle notes in there as well. All right. Some flavor picking rules that they describe in their book. Similar ingredients need a contrasting flavor. Contrasting ingredients need a unifying flavor. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Heavy flavors, so lots of base notes in your food needs a lift. They need some light notes, and light flavors, lots of those top notes need some grounding. They need a base note. Okay. All right. Moving to our next book, Salt, Fat, Acid, and Heat. So a lot of the good dishes that we eat rely on combinations of salt, fat, acid, and heat. All right, depending on that dish, the salting can be really quick, or it can take a long time, right, to fully draw out the flavors that you need. And so this book really helps to build an intuition for cooking and an intuition for ingredients for when you're starting to think about putting full dishes together. Okay, salt tends to heighten the flavors of our food. It makes food taste like the best version of itself. Fat brings some smoothness and flavor. Fats are also used to balance acids. Acids can brighten up heavy dishes. Acids can be sharp, and they help to balance fats. All right, that was that balancing that we talked about, or contrasting that we were talking about earlier from the last book. Heat helps to bring depth of flavor. All right, so we can use temperature to make our foods more savory. All right, so one example of a recipe from this book is her Persianish rice. Okay, we get the salt from cooking our rice in heavily salted water. When we take some of that rice and we mix it with yogurt, the yogurt brings both fat and acid. And finally, we use heat, right? So we take that rice and yogurt mixture, we put it in a hot pan with butter and oil, and after we put it in the pan, we add the rest of our rice to the top, and we're gonna cook that until the bottom layer of rice gets really browned and crispy. Okay, so we're using all of these components to make a full dish. All right, the last book I'm going to talk about is Flavor Pairing Theory. The idea behind flavor pairing theory is that ingredients that pair well tend to share important flavor molecules between them. All right, an example of this are strawberries and cilantro. All right, it's a weird sort of flavor pairing, right? Strawberries and cilantro or coriander, but each of them share very important flavor molecules. Okay, and the idea is that when we combine strawberry and cilantro, that one flavor molecule that they share, we're no longer experiencing in just the context of strawberry or just the context of cilantro. We're experiencing that flavor molecule in a new context. And so we're messing with our brain and the wiring in our brain and experiencing a new flavor, right? So we're generating new flavors by pairing ingredients that share similar molecules. An example of a recipe like this looks at the types of molecules shared by bourbon and fennel and plums and coffee, right? So in this dessert that he's come up with, all of these ingredients share very similar molecules, and we can take advantage of that in making a new recipe, right? And making a new ingredient pairing. Okay, so in this one, we melt some butter until it's browned. We add a little bit of sugar, and we cook some plums in that until the bottoms are browned. We then put in some fennel and cook it all until that's tender. We remove from the heat and stir in a quarter cup of bourbon for some more flavor and some salt. And finally, we garnish with basil and pecans. All right, so I said before that we can look at these recipes from different points of view. Really, whatever works best for you, whatever style of thought makes most sense to you. So we're going to look at this recipe from the other book's vantage points. All right, we can think about the base notes here. Our base notes are the roasted fennel, the browned plums, and the browned butter, right? Those all provide base notes. The top notes here are the garnish that we use at the end. We're going to garnish with basil and pecans. The middle notes are the ice cream and the plums, right? The parts of the plums that aren't browned on the bottom, right? So these provide important middle notes as well, right? So we can look at this recipe from the point of view of base notes, top notes, and middle notes. We can also look at this in terms of salt, fat, acid, and heat, right? We salt our roasted ingredients. The fats that we used browned butter and ice cream. We've layered our fats. And Samin Nosrat in her book talks about layering similar types of ingredients to get a really interesting flavor experience. Right, the acid comes from our plums and fennel, and the heat is provided by roasting our fennel, our plums, and browning our butter. Right, so we get all of these components coming together to make the foods that we're eating. All right. So thanks again for listening. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts, there's a number of ways to reach me. But go out and buy these books, right? They're great books, and I have learned a lot about putting ingredients together and building dishes from thinking about what these books have taught me. So thanks again. I hope you're all healthy and safe and comfortable.